Greetings, I'm your host, Dr. Wolfula, and when I'm not struggling to find a peaceful use for a device I call
the Doomsday Hellsphere,
I'm here at the Wolfula reviewing movies. One of these days, I'll figure out a way for that Hellsphere to benefit mankind. Mark my words. In today's video, I'll be reviewing the original Godzilla, aka Gojira, the first in a long line of kaiju films released by Toho, in this case directed by Ishiro Honda and released in 1954, this year marking its 70th anniversary. Plus, as a bonus, I'll also be reviewing the Americanized version of Godzilla and the first direct sequel, Godzilla Raids Again.
He claimed he saw a monster.
He saw a monster. He's had too much sake.
Before my reviews, let's talk a bit about how this monolithic, monstrous lizard of the atomic age came to be. World War II reached a dramatic end in late 1945 with the detonation of atomic bombs by the USA over Hiroshima and Nagasaki within the Empire of Japan. A little under a week after the second bomb was dropped, Emperor Showa announced his nation's surrender. The destructive, accelerated ending of the war came at a great human price, with the civilian deaths in Nagasaki and Hiroshima estimated at about 200,000. At the time, the act was presented by the states as a justified means to quickly end the war. Long-term loss of life would potentially be greater than the immediate loss of the bombings, but in retrospect, the bombings were more of a barbaric act of bravado, desperately looking for a last-minute excuse to show off what the USA could inflict on any future enemies, without thinking of the long-term consequences and unnecessary deaths of innocents. Mortal men playing with forces they didn't understand, and in the months following the bombings, initial survivors eventually died from their wounds or radiation sickness. The bombings did technically bring World War II to an end, but was it worth it? Probably not. Following Japan's defeat, its empire was dissolved, with the United States occupying Japan and reshaping Japan's political structure. During the 7 years that the USA occupied Japan, any dissent towards the United States was suppressed. Criticism of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, along with the United States' continued nuclear weapons tests, was especially censored. So when the United States finally ended its occupation of Japan, the Japanese people were quick to finally let out their bottled-up trauma regarding the bombings, especially on film. The Japanese were finally free to criticize America's bomb tests, but that didn't stop America from testing bombs anyway. One such test happened without warning in March 1954 at Bikini Atoll. The Castle Bravo hydrogen bomb detonation was the most powerful nuclear detonation ever carried out by the United States, and it unleashed heavy amounts of fallout on unsuspecting inhabitants of the nearby islands, who weren't evacuated until 2 days after the test left their homes uninhabitable. The Castle Bravo test occurred over 2,000 miles away from Japan, but its repercussions were still felt by the Japanese public. The crew of Lucky Dragon No. 5, a Japanese fishing vessel, bore witness to the blast from 80 miles away. Nuclear fallout rained upon the ship, contaminating its crew of 23, who quickly suffered from radiation sickness. The ship's radio operator died 6 months later, and many other crewmen suffered from cancer years after the fact. The Lucky Dragon incident shocked and enraged the Japanese populace. It was a grim reminder of what they lived through just 9 years prior, that history could easily repeat itself at any time. The Lucky Dragon's crew weren't the only thing aboard contaminated either. The fish they caught was radioactive, dubbed atomic tuna, and it led to a decline in Japanese fish sales out of fear of consuming contaminated fish. While all this fear and uncertainty was happening in 1954 Japan, Toho Company Limited, a Japanese film studio, was looking to make their next movie. Toho's attempt at producing a major film in Indonesia fell through, so they needed another movie to take its place on the schedule, and Toho producer Tomiyuki Tanaka became inspired to make it a giant monster movie, or kaiju film.
It was beauty killed the beast.
The original King Kong had recently been re-released to great success internationally, and another newer giant monster film, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, was a major hit at the box office. The latter film in particular concerned a nuclear bomb test that awakened awakens a slumbering dinosaur frozen in the Arctic that goes on a rampage in New York City. Sound familiar? In the wake of the Lucky Dragon incident, and with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki still fresh in the minds of the Japanese population, Toho figured they could take the premise of the beast from 20,000 Fathoms, but turn it into something that would resonate more with Japanese audiences. Instead of a nuclear weapon serving as a mere plot device, Toho's first monster film would be a warning against the use of nuclear weapons altogether, with the monster at the center itself serving as an allegory for the atom bomb and its devastating consequences. Initially nonsensically titled The Giant Monster from 20,000 Miles Beneath the Sea, and codenamed Project G as in Giant, the film was eventually titled Gojira, a portmanteau of gorilla and Gojira, or whale. There are conflicting stories for the source of the name Gojira, which doesn't make sense considering the monster is a dinosaur and not a gorilla or whale, but supposedly Toho held a contest within the company to decide the name, but others have said that Gojira was the name of a huge lumbering Toho employee, while others still claim that nobody knows where the name Gojira came from. Where it came from and whether or not the name makes sense, the name Gojira stuck, and it sounds good, much like the American version of the name, Godzilla. What the hell's a Zilla? I don't know, but it sounds cool. And Zilla has gone on to become slang for a monster. Add Zilla to any name and it instantly sounds monstrous. And the original Godzilla was obviously a monstrous hit in its home nation, but for 50 years it actually was never made officially available in its original unaltered form overseas, and with 37 sequels and 70 years of kaiju history since, does the original Godzilla still stand strong today? You bet it does. Here's my review of Godzilla. But first I have a message from my sponsor, me! Pledge to my Patreon today to support the channel and help it continue to grow, and you'll also get access to weekly movie nights every Sunday, and archive commentaries if you miss the movie nights live. Just $5 a month to get a movie night every week. Here's the movie I'll be streaming next Sunday. Pledge to patreon.com/Dr. Wolfula if you're interested in my bonus streams, and I thank you in advance. Godzilla begins with various ships mysteriously destroyed in the waters near Japan, blamed by an elder on an ancient creature known as, well, Godzilla. And during a violent storm, a fishing village on the island of Odo finds itself further devastated by the mysterious force plaguing the sea. After the attack, Odo villagers request an investigation to solve their woes, and it's here where the four key human characters of the film come into play. Dr. Kyohei Yamane, a paleontologist/biology professor enlisted to investigate the destruction. Emiko Yamane, the doc's young and approachable daughter/assistant. Dr. Daisuke Serizawa, Emiko's fiancé who lost his eye in the war and who totally isn't a mad scientist busy working on a device called the Oxygen Destroyer. And finally, Hideto Ogata, a sailor in the Japanese Coast Guard who Emiko is really in love with. A big but negligible aspect of Godzilla's plot is a love triangle between Emiko, her fiancé Dr. Serizawa, and the man she really loves, Hideto. It's a very strange love triangle, though, because Dr. Serizawa is totally checked out in the relationship. He's in love with his work, not Emiko. He has no interest in marrying her, but Emiko still feels some sense of devotion to her fiancé anyway. That's keeping her from moving forward with Hideto. On one hand, the love triangle acts as a commentary on the new status quo for women in Japan. Before World War II ended, Japanese women couldn't vote, and marriages were often arranged. So Emiko finds herself in conflict with the traditional values she was raised with, feeling obligated to marry the man chosen by her father, versus following her heart by being with the man she actually loves. At the same time, Dr. Serizawa wears an eye patch. Chicks dig eye patches. They're irresistible. In practice, the love triangle just serves the purpose of making Emiko relevant to all three male characters in the movie and act as a motivation for them by crying a lot. Much like Ann Darrow before her, Emiko moves the plot along, but she doesn't actually do anything herself. At least she isn't a damsel in distress, though. On Odo Island, Dr. Yamane finds that the wrecked village is horribly irradiated, and amid the devastation, he discovers a dead trilobite that's still fresh, which would be a pretty amazing discovery if 5 minutes later Yamane's team didn't also see a 160-foot-tall dinosaur towering over a ridge, the titular Godzilla. There are opposing views on whether or not Japan's government should keep Godzilla's existence a secret to avoid an unnecessary panic. But when you're dealing with a giant dinosaur, it's kinda hard to keep it under your hat when it's taking a bite out of trains in downtown Tokyo. Godzilla was initially envisioned to be a giant squid, but that would probably look too goofy, so Toho settled on making him a dinosaur, implied to have been hibernating beneath the seafloor until the USA's bomb tests destroyed his subterranean home, mutated him, gave him atomic breath, and really fucking pissed him off in the process. The Japanese military is obviously trying its best to wipe Godzilla out, but when a monster is proven to be able to withstand a nuclear explosion, little missiles aren't going to prove effective. Obviously, Godzilla is meant to be a living metaphor for the atom bomb, this mindless force of destruction let loose against Japanese innocents. But Dr. Yamane sees Godzilla, despite its devastation, from a more sympathetic perspective, simply as an animal fighting back against mankind for destroying its home. And Yamane is convinced that Godzilla could potentially benefit mankind, that Godzilla must be studied due to its immunity to radiation. Godzilla could make the threat of nuclear weapons, or at least the long-term effects of radiation sickness and contamination, a thing of the past. Though it's really fucking hard to study a creature when it's 160 feet tall, virtually indestructible, and blowing shit up with its atomic breath, but Dr. Yamane's heart is at least in the right place. The effects of Godzilla were initially intended to be executed entirely through stop-motion animation, like with the original King Kong, but effects supervisor Eiji Tsuburaya calculated that it would take years to animate all of the effect shots necessary with the limited staff and budget available to him. So it was ultimately decided to almost exclusively use Soupmation, a fancy term for having a guy in a monster costume, in this case worn by Haruo Nakajima and Katsumi Tezuka. But ultimately, most of the footage that made the final cut of Godzilla used Nakajima in the suit, and he went on to play Godzilla in 11 of its sequels. The Godzilla suit used in the original film was obviously bulky, weighing over 200 pounds, and made of thick fabric and latex. The suit made it difficult for Nakajima to move in or even wear for extended periods. He could only wear the entire suit for minutes before becoming exhausted, so for any shots that only partially showed Godzilla, Nakajima would only wear the pieces of the suit that were necessary. Soupmation comes with certain benefits over stop motion. The suit is obviously less articulated than a stop-motion puppet would have been, but because you're actually shooting Soupmation in real time, it allows for smoother, steadier, more impactful movement of a monster. Stop-motion animated shots around this time also had to be very static, but when you're dealing with Soupmation, it's like with any other kind of actor, so it allows for much more freedom moving the camera and using different angles for shots. The menace behind Godzilla relies heavily in how he's shot, very often only in silhouette. It makes for a dark, imposing threat, selling the scale of the beast as he towers over, well, towers from low-angle shots. Godzilla's iconic roar is enough to invoke terror. Putting a monster in the middle of a miniature city also allows for a more realistic and dynamic simulation of the destruction Godzilla would cause if it actually was 160 feet tall. With stop motion, everything has to be pre-decided, but when you're depicting true chaos, the only way to accurately do that is by causing destruction in real time. Obviously, Godzilla is just a guy in a suit, but beyond the effects, what ultimately sells Godzilla as not only a giant monster, but an existential threat to mankind is how the movie gradually reveals the King of Monsters. Before you see Godzilla, you experience his destruction purely from the limited perspective of the people being devastated beneath him. His mythology is built out of a legend a village elder tells of a time hundreds of years ago when they'd sacrifice girls to the beast King Kong style. The ceremony sans sacrifice remains to this day. When Godzilla finally appears, before he lets loose against Tokyo, there are scenes of officials estimating the potential damage the monster could cause if left unchecked. There's a lot of build-up to Godzilla's rampage that makes the beast so much larger in a viewer's mind. The movie does everything it can to make Godzilla believable, and that ultimately comes down to the director Ishido Honda taking the material seriously. At the time, monster movies and even sci-fi films were usually treated as B-movies that often weren't taken seriously by anybody, even by the people making them. But the original Godzilla takes itself very seriously. There's virtually no humor in the film. Usually a movie like this would have some comic relief here and there, but that'd be akin to putting jokes in a movie about the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The original Godzilla is presented almost like it really is a documentary about something that happened in Japan, and in some ways it is. Just swap bombs with a giant dinosaur. The scenes of a mother preparing her children for death, irradiated survivors at a hospital, many of them children, it's all very powerfully tragic material. But imagine you're a Japanese citizen watching this film less than a decade after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and you're confronted with images of a devastated, irradiated Tokyo while watching a monster movie. The film grounds its horror in real-life horror, a bold move for the time. A lot of giant monster movies treat destruction as a cool spectacle to passively watch, but the original Godzilla never loses sight of the human loss this devastation causes. It captures a very real sense of terror and tragedy if something like Godzilla really was let on the loose. Godzilla the film also demonstrates Japan's desire to be self-sufficient again following America's occupation and show Japan's strength as a rebuilt nation. Godzilla is purely a Japanese story. Japan in the film never calls for outside help. They handle the Godzilla situation entirely on their own. They're the victims of atomic destruction. It's up to them alone to save themselves from it. A strong message in a post-war Japan. Ultimately, what's the solution to something like Godzilla, though? A threat created by the deadliest weapon known to humanity. Well, an even deadlier weapon, I suppose. Emiko's fiancé, Dr. Serizawa, has independently developed a device known as an oxygen destroyer, a deus ex machina that can instantly liquefy the oxygen atoms in a living thing. Savage as fuck. But Serizawa didn't invent this to defeat Godzilla. In fact, the oxygen destroyer's purpose isn't entirely clear. Serizawa claims that he hasn't made his device known to the public because he hasn't found a peaceful use for it. But why invent something like an oxygen destroyer to begin with if not for use as a weapon? What other purpose could it possibly have? It'd be like making the atomic bomb in the hopes that it'll somehow make puppies even cuter. Whatever, the ultimate conflict of Godzilla isn't in destroying Godzilla. It's in if destroying Godzilla is worth it. Dr. Serizawa has always had the means to defeat Godzilla, but having witnessed the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Serizawa feels he has a moral responsibility to withhold use of the oxygen destroyer out of fear that it will go on to be used as a weapon of greater devastation than the atomic bomb and cause more harm than Godzilla in the long term. Unlike the makers of the atomic bombs, Serizawa is mindful of his oxygen destroyer's consequences, but is ultimately appealed to by a bunch of teenage girls singing a sad song played to footage of a destroyed Tokyo. Very emotionally manipulative, but hey, it gets results. Godzilla disappears for much of the final act, and his defeat isn't exactly action-packed, but the film has a strong emotional climax. Serizawa is convinced to use the oxygen destroyer on Godzilla deep under the sea, on the undisclosed condition that Serizawa die alongside the monster, so the knowledge of how to create the oxygen destroyer can be lost with Serizawa, as he and Godzilla both are vaporized. This sacrifice also allows Emiko to be with the man she actually loves. I guess everything is wrapped up in a neat little package. What? I'm serious. Sorry if I sounded sarcastic. Except, of course, there could be other Godzillas out there, just waiting to be awoken by atomic weapons. So the film's final message acts as a plea to end nuclear weapons testing. Or else another Godzilla might show up. Okay, so Godzilla isn't real, but in this case, he's still a metaphor for death and destruction. But maybe Godzilla is real. We don't know for sure. That's something to also worry about, I suppose.
現れてくるかもしれない。
The original Godzilla is a masterpiece for unflinchingly depicting the mindless devastation of nuclear bombs without actually depicting a single nuclear bomb, anthropomorphizing the atom bomb into an iconic villain. The film was able to communicate an important message through pure entertainment that could appeal to a wide audience despite such grim subject matter, and 70 years on, Godzilla and its message are still relevant today. And Godzilla remains the king of all monsters, the kaiju all others are measured against. I give Godzilla an atom bomb out of oxygen destroyer. I've taken Kyoto off the Godzilla target list due to its cultural significance to the Japanese people. Also, my wife and I honeymoon there. It's a magnificent city.
Once a city of 6 million people. Tokyo, a smoldering memorial to the unknown.
Now, the original Godzilla is a classic, but for years it wasn't actually available officially in the United States. Instead, America got a retooled version of the original Godzilla in the form of Godzilla King of the Monsters, released in 1956 and featuring new scenes directed by Terry O. Morse.
When I think back, only a few days ago I was en route to Cairo.
American film producers saw great box office potential in Godzilla, and the rights were purchased from Toho for a measly $25,000. In the eyes of the American producers, there was one problem with the original Godzilla preventing its release. The cast was entirely Japanese. There wasn't much of an audience for foreign films in the USA during the 50s, and with the less than flattering depiction of Japanese in American media and World War II propaganda, American audiences at the time were unfortunately unlikely to see even a spectacle like Godzilla if it didn't have a recognizable star to draw them in. So the original Godzilla wasn't just dubbed in English like many subsequent kaiju films, because there wasn't a proven market for dubbed kaiju films in America yet, or dubbed foreign films in general. So Trans World Releasing Corporation not only decided to redub and re-edit Godzilla for American audiences, but they also added a recognizable star to the story. Raymond Burr of Rear Window and Perry Mason fame. Not exactly Brando, but it's something.
My name is Steve Martin, foreign correspondent for United World News.
In Godzilla King of the Monsters, Raymond Burr plays Steve Martin, but ironically he looks a lot more like John Candy.
It would have been impossible for anyone to convince me that I would ever see Tokyo like this again.
This isn't a black and white version of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, though. Raymond Burr plays a journalist on his way to Cairo, who makes a stop in Tokyo to meet with his friend Dr. Serizawa. But the two men never actually do meet, because no new footage of Akihiko Harada as Dr. Serizawa was shot for the film. Instead, Steve Martin gives Serizawa an awkward phone call where the film hides an obvious body double's face behind test tubes. The body double doesn't even have the same haircut.
Emiko is coming over this evening, and she said it was important.
All right, I'll check with you tomorrow.
Serizawa and half of the male leads in this version were voiced by veteran actor James Hong, just getting his start in the movie business.
Did you finish with your experiments?
Yes.
This one scene with Serizawa on the phone essentially sums up the entire process of making the Americanized cut of Godzilla. The film surrounds Raymond Burr with Asian American extras, and they're edited into existing scenes from the original Godzilla, just reacting to or commenting on things happening in the original film, as if they were actually there.
When I'd last seen Emiko, she had just become engaged to Dr. Serizawa. It was the usual triangle. It was to play an important part in the lives of millions of people.
It's like watching a movie about a guy watching a movie, but when Raymond Burr had to actually interact with characters from the original film, they just intercut close-ups of the original actors with over-the-shoulder shots of body doubles in front of Burr.
Dr. Yamane.
Steve Martin, it is good to see you.
Even if you didn't know it going into this version of Godzilla, it's plainly obvious this white guy was tacked onto this movie years later.
Look at the size of those footprints.
King of the Monsters tries to sell Raymond Burr as the main character, but his role in the film is as a passive observer. He doesn't affect the plot or other characters in any meaningful ways, so it makes his inclusion awkward and pointless. They shot all of Raymond Burr's scenes in under a week, and the budget was obviously shoestring. Because the story in this version is initially non-linear and told through flashbacks, to try to tie it all together, they have Raymond Burr narrate the entire movie.
Godzilla was still in Tokyo Bay, and there was every reason to believe he would return.
even scenes his character wasn't present for.
The marriage between Emiko and Dr. Serizawa had been arranged when they were both children.
To try to explain lapses in the plot or provide some context on Japanese culture. And I will say, the narration does make the film feel more like a documentary.
300,000 volts of electricity strung around the city is a barrier against Godzilla.
Like this is something that actually happened, so it works on that level, but it's still pretty goofy and unnecessary.
George, here in Tokyo, time has been turned back 2 million years.
Besides a random white guy, some dubbing and narration though, the story of Godzilla King of the Monsters is mostly the same, but the telling of the story is extremely toned down for an American audience. The anti-nuclear themes are removed, there's no real deeper meaning behind this version of the film, it's just a giant monster movie. Godzilla just emerges from the sea and randomly attacks Tokyo for no reason. King of the Monsters still works fine as a giant monster movie, but its impact is weaker without the powerful message behind it. Instead replaced by a more hopeful tone in the final scene, it's discordant with the intended themes of the movie.
The menace was gone, so was a great man. But the whole world could wake up and live again.
They also tried to add more of a sense of humor to this version of Godzilla, mostly in reference to Steve Martin's tenuous grasp of the Japanese language and customs.
Serizawa Sensei Deska.
You are a better newspaperman than a linguist.
It just comes off a bit embarrassing and makes the movie seem cheesy, less believable, like they just can't take this seriously, and need to add Raymond Burr mugging in front of the camera to try to give the film some credibility. King of the Monsters adds material in, but it still somehow manages at 80 minutes to be 15 minutes shorter than the original Japanese cut of Godzilla. So you're getting significantly less movie with this version, and what takes the place of many removed scenes is just fucking garbage, with some jag-off hanging out in an office and occasionally watching Godzilla do shit.
Steve Martin signing off from Tokyo, Japan.
Godzilla King of the Monsters isn't a bad movie. It's still mostly the original Godzilla, which is good. It's just a worse version of a good movie, with some rushed dubbing.
And what will become of us if a weapon such as I now have falls into the wrong hands?
Unnecessary character addition, and no meaning behind any of the destruction. Before the advent of DVD, King of the Monsters used to be the only version of the original Godzilla officially available internationally for years, until the Japanese cut was finally released in the US in 2006, and became the standard version going forward. 50 years of the fucking Steve Martin cut, so obviously for multiple generations, King of the Monsters was the version of Godzilla people outside of Japan grew up with. And the movie still managed to gain a following in this neutered form, which says something. It was the version that Steven Spielberg saw as a kid that inspired him to eventually direct Jurassic Park. And King of the Monsters was ultimately successful in its own way, finding an audience for Godzilla overseas, and opening the door for future Japanese media to be localized in America in very awkward and shitty ways initially, but hey, you gotta start somewhere. Godzilla King of the Monsters is a very important piece of Godzilla in Japanese localization history. It's the film that gave Godzilla his famous Americanized name, after all, and also dubbed him the King of the Monsters. But now that the original Japanese cut of Godzilla is readily available, there's very little reason to watch the Americanized version today, beyond just as a curiosity to a modern Godzilla fan. I give Godzilla King of the Monsters a Steve Martin out of better Steve Martin.
Godzilla has turned the heart of Tokyo into a sea of fire.
As a bonus, I have a review of Godzilla Raids Again, known as Godzilla's Counterattack in Japan, the first Godzilla sequel, released in 1955, less than a year after the original film's release, and the only Godzilla sequel shot in black and white. The director of the original Godzilla, Ishido Honda, had no intentions for a sequel, obviously. Godzilla is fucking disintegrated at the end of the original, but the first Godzilla, despite failing to end nuclear testing, was a massive box office success in Japan. So a sequel was quickly greenlit without the involvement of Honda, and he was replaced with Motoyoshi Oda, who wasn't exactly a director with an artistic vision like Ishido Honda. Oda was fine just delivering the bare minimum expected of a monster film, and hey, he does just that with Godzilla Raids Again.
Gojira King 105 月を書き
The plot of the sequel concerns two pilots. The hero, Sukiyaki, comes to the rescue of his sidekick, Kobayashi, who had engine trouble and landed on a mysterious island.
全係の2人の女性に捧げるんだな。うるさ方が命の恩人とは。
It's here on this island where the two pilots encounter out of nowhere a new Godzilla fighting Anguirus, an Ankylosaurus-like monster, and the two beasts take their fight to Osaka, since Tokyo was destroyed in the last movie.
ゴジラに違いない。
The Godzilla seen in Raids Again is just another member of the first Godzilla species, and he just happened to also be fucking around on the surface, and the second generation Godzilla ended up being the most prolific incarnation, appearing in 14 films and eventually becoming a hero and a lot cuter. But in Raids Again, Godzilla's just as destructive as his predecessor, and he also has to kick another giant dinosaur's ass. As the first Godzilla sequel, Raids Again established the formula of most of the Godzilla sequels going forward. There's a monster on the loose besides Godzilla, so he has to go kick some ass because Japan literally isn't big enough for the both of them. It's not even big enough for the one of them. Because Godzilla has to fight another monster this time around, the Godzilla suit used for this film was greatly improved, allowing Haruo Nakajima better mobility, and I assume, much like in Dark Knight, it allowed him to turn his head. To facilitate some of the effects in fighting, though, some shots of Godzilla and Anguirus actually used hand puppets, and it looks about as good as you'd expect. And Anguirus is supposed to be quadrupedal, but he very often and obviously just looks like a guy on his hands and knees. There's no depth to Godzilla Raids Again like the first film, no deeper meaning behind it, which might have been intentional from the start. Many Japanese film critics at the time took the original Godzilla to task for including anti-nuclear themes, declaring it exploitative of the nation's shared grief. So Toho probably figured they could downplay messages in favor of just making a matinee popcorn flick nobody could be offended by, but simultaneously nobody would remember. Don't get me wrong, it's cool to watch two monsters fuck each other up, but this was the first time this was done, and it's pretty crude and repetitive. It doesn't even look like they're fighting sometimes, it looks like they're struggling to move in their costumes. Raids Again lacks the deeper meaning of the original Godzilla, but also lacks the effort and campiness the later sequels would have. Raids Again just doesn't have a strong sense of identity of its own, and the only narrative link to the original film is a cameo by Dr. Yamane playing a clip show of the first movie, and telling everybody they're basically screwed since the only guy who knew how to make a weapon to defeat Godzilla is fucking dead. To pad the movie out, there's also some dopey subplot involving some escaped convicts on the loose during the monster's battle. I guess so they could show evil characters being terrorized and killed by the destruction instead of innocents. It's easier to think about the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima if you just pretend the only people killed were criminals. Speaking of innocents killed, near the now ruined Osaka castle, eventually Godzilla gives Anguirus a deadly hickey, winning the battle. Savage as fuck! After Anguirus' defeat, Godzilla recedes into the ocean. A happy ending if you ignore all of Osaka being destroyed. This is a false ending though. The main characters Tsukioka and Kobayashi, who are only really passive observers up to this point, end up relocating to snowy Hokkaido, the basis of the Sinnoh region from Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. After like 15 minutes of drinking sake, eventually Godzilla shows up again, destroying ships, so Tsukioka takes it upon himself to hunt Godzilla down, and before Kobayashi joins his friend, Kobayashi makes it known to the audience that he's fallen in love, so his death in the next scene can be extra tragic. Kobayashi! No! Ultimately, this Godzilla is defeated in a less definitive way to make sequels a little easier without having to say that there's just another Godzilla again. So the planes fire at the snowy mountains surrounding Godzilla, causing the beast to become buried by an avalanche. But Godzilla has atomic heat breath. How could I stop him? Oh, fuck it, whatever. Like with the original Godzilla, Raids Again received an Americanized version, but an even lazier Americanization that tried to pass itself off as anything but a Godzilla sequel. Godzilla Raids Again eventually saw release in the USA in 1959 under the title Gigantus the Fire Monster, with Godzilla's name changed to Gigantus.
Who is there among us who knows the way to destroy Gigantus?
The producers of this American version didn't want to have to say somehow Godzilla returned after he was disintegrated in the first movie, so they figured it'd be more convenient to just pass Godzilla off as a new monster altogether called Gigantus.
The Osaka area has just alerted against an imminent attack by the Gigantus monster.
But the first Godzilla was a pretty big hit in America. I'd figure it'd be more confusing to people watching a movie called Gigantus and seeing what is clearly Godzilla in it. Isn't that fucking Godzilla? Gigantus was supposed to be an entirely new movie titled The Volcano Monsters that would only use the monster footage from Godzilla Raids Again, with an entirely new human plot and some new monster footage shot in the States. But 4 years had passed since Raids Again was released in Japan, and the Godzilla and Anguirus costumes were in poor condition, so eventually the producers decided to just do a dub of Raids Again and call it Gigantus. And it's a really fucking shitty dub with some embarrassing performances.
A new book came out and we learned so much, and it is called Anguillosaurus, Killer of the Living.
Though it does feature Key Luke of future Gremlins fame in the lead role narrating most of the movie.
Hidemi and I drove in her father's car toward her home. Time was precious.
George Takei also lends some voice work early in his career.
We have just sighted Gigantus, and we are giving pursuit.
Overall, though, the dub just sounds really cartoony.
Kogawa area evacuated, sir.
Good. Area 2 evacuated.
Like we're watching a live-action version of a Hanna-Barbera cartoon.
One prison truck especially contained a group of the most dangerous convicts in the land.
The dub also mixes in stock footage from totally unrelated films like The Lost World, and the original score for Raids Again, composed by Masaru Sato, is almost entirely replaced by stock music. Gigantus also tries to tack on a phony Hollywood ending where Tsukioka quickly moves on from the grief of his friend's death.
We were together for all time now, and we could once more live out our lives in happiness.
Gigantus takes a film that's kinda mediocre and turns it into a movie that really sucks ass. Just a rushed dub so it could be a double feature with teenagers from outer space. A film whose only claim to fame is being riffed in a Mystery Science Theater 3000 episode.
Ooh, now Michael Jackson will want him.
Godzilla Raids Again, in its original Japanese cut though, is an okay movie. It's rushed, and they hadn't figured out how to quite make a Godzilla sequel work yet, but it has its moments, and it's not terrible, just not particularly memorable. And despite Godzilla Raids Again being a hit, it wasn't well received, and there wouldn't be another Godzilla movie for nearly a decade, the longest gap of time between sequels during the franchise's Showa era. And I could see why they needed to take some time to figure things out after this first attempt at a sequel. I give Godzilla Raids Again a Tsukioka out of Kobayashi. Rest in power, Kobayashi. This video is made possible through the pledges of my Patreon supporters, and I'd like to give a very special thanks to the kind folks pledged to my shoutouts tier. All of the support on Patreon means a lot to me, and it helps my dark influence continue to grow. If you like this video, like it, and if you loved it, click the subscribe and bell buttons for more vids. Be sure to also keep in touch by following me on social media at Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Dr. Wolfula. While I still have your attention, consider pledging to my Patreon to support the channel and get bonus content like previews, VIP Discord server access, private movie night streams, and credits in videos. Consider pledging at patreon.com/Dr. Wolfula. Also, check out official Dr. Wolfula t-shirts and other merch on tpublic.com/user/Dr. Wolfula. Thanks for watching. See you all next time. Dr. Wolfula signing out.